Hello again, welcome back. I'm wrapped up a bit today because it is pretty chilly, which might give you a clue as to what I'm going to be talking about in a minute. But also I wanted to say that I haven't always done this job. There was a time before I was on HCB. In fact, I worked for a few years for Drury Shipping Consultants, who some of you may know. And during my time there, I developed, I like to think, some expertise in the LNG sector. Because in those days, it was a lot simpler. LNG tankers moved methane from A to B, came back empty, and did it all over again. And I think the total world fleet stood at about 77 ships, of which about 10% were in long-term layup. Things are very different these days. LNG has grown enormously, especially since the development. I think what really kicked it off was the opening up of gas fields by Qatar. Conversely, although it's a much bigger business, these days HCB doesn't cover it as much because since it got so big, other titles have come in and really taken the field to themselves. And when we were covering it, I do remember getting a letter once from somebody in the business who said, "Well, why do you write about LNG? LNG is not hazardous." She had part of a point. LNG, which is, as you know, natural gas refrigerated to minus 161 degrees Celsius, at which point it turns into a liquid and then occupies 1/600th of its original volume. So you can put it in a ship and economically carry it somewhere. But when it's in that state, it's inert, pretty much, apart from the methane that's boiling off. So that's one reason why LNG ships tend to go on for a long time. The LNG itself causes no corrosion to the inside of the cargo tanks or the piping. If you fell into it, it would do you a lot of harm. And also, of course, because there is a risk of a leak of gas, there has been concern on the part of some. And I do remember, I think it was in the days when the US was a big LNG importer. Now it's an exporter. That tankers coming into the port of Baltimore had to go in backwards under the bridge because there was no room for them to turn around, and the port authority insisted that in the event of an incident they ought to be able to get out of the way quick. And US consumer groups were also worried about it. And there was a plan to try and allay their fears by using one of the old ships in layup, filling it with LNG, taking it into the middle Atlantic and getting the US Air Force to come and fire a missile at it, which would have been interesting. I don't know who was going to pay for it. The theory was the missile would probably go straight through the cargo tanks out the other side, and the gas would just leak out and pool on the ocean. So this LNG trade has now been going on for a long time, back from the early 70s. And a lot of expertise has been built up in how to move LNG safely. As far as I know, there has never been a significant incident involving the transport of LNG by sea. But there are things that are happening at the moment in the supply chain that make it more important than ever that those who are using LNG or other cryogenic ways of moving flammable liquids and gases, they have to be aware of if that safety record is going to be maintained. LNG has been identified, for instance, as one of the ways of meeting the IMO sulfur restrictions. as a fuel for ships. It's also being touted and used indeed as a fuel for heavy-duty trucks. I'm not sure if it'll ever make much of a dent in the domestic car fuel business, but CNG does, for instance. And of course, there are also now a growing fleet of small-scale ships used to distribute LNG in various parts of the world to terminals and to consumers in places where they don't get piped gas. And that may be in northern Norway, it may be upriver in China, it may be in Scotland. But there are plenty of examples of that going on. And again, those involved need to be aware of the hazards and the equipment that has been proven over decades to reduce those risks. You can't do anything about the hazard of cryogenic liquid, but you can mitigate the risks. And if you want to know more, if you're involved and you're worried, then there are sources of information, and the primary one, for me anyway, would be the Society of International Gas Tanker and Terminal Operators, SIGTO, which has been writing the rules on this for decades now. So I wouldn't say don't use LNG, and I wouldn't say it's as hazardous as some other things that we write about, but there are hazards involved. So do take care, because I want to see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.